In the autumn of 1939, the lights were going out all over Britain. Places of entertainment were being closed and a blackout imposed. Britain mobilized for war, but only had a meager 10 divisions of troops. They departed for France to join a much bigger French army of nearly 100 divisions. Placed under the overall command of the French Commander-in-Chief, General Maurice Gamelin, the British troops were deployed along the French-Belgian border, largely in an area that was familiar to British troops of the First World War. War had been declared to support Poland, but how is this army going to help that country? Surely the only way was by invading Germany while their armed forces were still in Poland. British troops waited for orders from their French commanders, but no orders were forthcoming. Frustrated, the Allied troops sat and stared at an empty border, doing nothing, going nowhere, seeing no enemy. Churchill described this as a twilight war. An American senator called it a phony war. The expression stuck. Throughout an exceptionally cold winter, morale in the largely conscript French army was low. Signs of drunkenness and absenteeism began to grow, while their out-of-touch high command shut itself away in its fortress at Vincennes on the outskirts of Paris. The question that would soon be asked was whether the French armed forces were sufficiently organized and committed to withstand the inevitable Blitzkrieg that was to come from the German war machine. Paris in the 1920s and 30s. These became known as the Crazy Years, as the French tried to shake off the after effects of the First World War. Parisian culture flourished, but increasingly a political divide widened between the right and the left. Governments came and went with regularity, while riots and protests filled the streets. A lack of political direction left the military rudderless and complacent. Uninspired and unchallenged, French generals believed future wars would be dominated by defense, with set-piece battles developing slowly through the use of infantry and artillery, while they viewed tanks and aircraft as having only a supporting role. In the view of André Beaufry, a post-Second World War commander of the French army, and at the time a junior staff officer, this thinking was born more of a complacency from victory in 1918 rather than from any deep military strategic thinking. As he famously said, victory is a very dangerous opportunity. During that first month of war, Germany's army was focused on fighting and defeating Poland, leaving their western front open to attack. On the 7th of September, before any British troops had arrived in France, hesitantly, elements of the French army crossed onto German soil in what became known as the Saar Offensive. Initially, French progress was relatively swift and smooth, with only very limited resistance encountered. In less than a week, they had pushed about 5 miles into Germany. However, the Germans soon organised a small force that checked French progress. A week later, just as the first British troops were arriving in France, General Gamelin ordered his troops to withdraw. Then in October, perhaps reasoning that the Allies had no purpose in now supporting Poland as that country ceased to exist, Hitler offered both France and Britain an opportunity to make peace. He told the Reichstag,
"War, as an enterprise, is where all participants are losers, having endured millions of deaths and billions in lost wealth."
Hitler made it clear that an agreement would need to include a solution and settlement of what he described as the Jewish problem. And he finished his speech by stating,
"If, however, the opinions of Messrs. Churchill and his followers should prevail, this statement will have been my last."
The Allies rejected Hitler's offer, and by mid-October, with Poland defeated, much of Germany's army had moved to the Western Front. German guns were now able to pound forward French positions along the Maginot Line, and the Luftwaffe was able to operate with near impunity in the air above. Briefly, the German First Army was ordered to take offensive action against the French. While only a few square miles of territory was actively contested, there was that month a bitter and bloody battle, with almost 200 German soldiers losing their lives. Hitler, though, needed to secure his western border before continuing with his planned expansion to the east. The Soviet Union had all the land he needed, plus many valuable raw materials that Germany did not possess. And he viewed Russian leaders as common, blood-stained criminals with an inconceivable gift for lying. He believed their country was controlled by Jews, intent upon dominating the world and inflicting the same fate upon Germany as they had to Russia. The danger of fighting a war on two fronts had long since been a German foreign policy and military preoccupation. By the mid-20th century, the increased importance of air power meant that Germany's prime industrial area, the Ruhr Valley, was within range of Allied attacks from France, as well as Belgium and the Netherlands. Germany's war effort in the east could therefore be compromised by Allied attacks upon this industrial base, staged entirely from within the border of the Allied countries. A further consideration was the desire to undermine and restrict Britain's naval dominance and world trade. For this, Germany required ports with quicker and easier access to the Atlantic Ocean than those located along the North Sea that could be blockaded by the British fleet. By the end of October, the German High Command had drawn up an initial plan for the invasion of France. It would be launched through central Belgium with the intention of pushing the Allied armies deployed along the Franco-Belgian border south as far as the River Somme. They expected 500,000 German soldiers to be killed, causing their army to hold a position on the Somme until sufficiently reinforced, possibly as long as 2 years. However, despite Germany's success in Poland, that campaign had thrown up a number of difficulties, particularly within the panzer divisions. Keeping such fast-moving units supplied was a logistical problem that needed a rethink. And of greater concern were the tanks themselves. They were too small, too lightly armoured, and apt to break down, leaving concern amongst German generals that they might not fare well against much larger and more heavily gunned French tanks. As a result, Hitler was persuaded by the German High Command to hold off an invasion of France to allow time to upgrade the tanks. It also provided time for certain German generals to rethink and refine their plans for an attack upon France. During the European wars of the mid-18th century, the Prussian army regularly defeated other countries' significantly larger armies. Their commander, Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, was believed by Napoleon to be the greatest general that ever lived. Frederick trained his troops meticulously to enable him to carry out skillful maneuvers on the battlefield, like, for example, the oblique order, where he would pinpoint his attack upon a single part of the enemy's line, often its flank or some weak position. By concentrating overwhelming force there, Frederick inflicted crushing defeats on major European powers of that time. Frederick was just one of a succession of Hohenzollern family rulers that turned the relatively small German province of Brandenburg into the Kingdom of Prussia, which later, under Otto von Bismarck, would become the unified country of Germany. Brandenburg had few natural resources and unfavorable farming conditions. They acquired a further province through marriage in Poland called East Prussia, which was little better provisioned. The Hohenzollerns therefore sought their route to glory through military means, with conquest and land acquisition coming via a highly proficient army. By the second half of the 18th century, they had considerably increased their territory via conquest, with further parts of northern Poland later added towards the end of the century. Germany's defeat in the First World War was a bitter blow to Prussian military prowess. But despite their defeat, German army officers almost immediately turned their thinking towards how to win the next war. With senior officers having been schooled in the Prussian military tradition, a new way of fighting started to develop in the 1920s, well before Hitler came to power. Their thoughts were further influenced by the enforced reduction in the size of the German army by the victors of the First World War: Britain, Italy, France, and the United States. So once again, the German army sought tactics where fewer soldiers could defeat greater numbers, as had Frederick the Great. This led to their strategy of dislocation. They sought to avoid an enemy's most heavily defended areas. Instead, they would concentrate their attacks upon weaker positions, which would be less attritional. Having overwhelmed such positions, speed was of the essence, advancing swiftly before the enemy could reorganize, thus dislocating their defenses, communications, and supply lines. In 1931, a rising star within the German army called Heinz Guderian became Chief of Staff of Germany's motorized troops. He now became significant in developing the idea of the Panzer Division. By 1936, his ideas were published in a book called Achtung Panzer, which was never studied by French generals. The Panzer Division would prove to be the ideal unit in the strategy of dislocation. This new way of fighting was unleashed upon Poland in September 1939, and with the role of the Luftwaffe added, soon acquired the nickname Blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, the German High Command's plans for the invasion of France in October 1939 were based upon Germany's First World War Schlieffen Plan, which was originally designed to defeat France in 6 weeks allowing Germany to turn its full military might on Russia. However, that strategy had been unsuccessful, largely due to British and Canadian resistance in Flanders and especially the Ypres salient. General Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of Germany's Army Group A for the invasion of France in 1940, thought that the plan was flawed. To him, it was too obvious, and it would leave the French army intact. Plus, it did not adhere to German military principles of manoeuvre and encirclement. Together with his chief of staff, General Erich von Manstein, they reworked the plan, gaining Hitler's personal approval. Both of these generals came from military families that had served for generations in the Prussian army. So with their military backgrounds, their plan for the invasion of France would turn out to be the finest example in the use of concentrated forces to dislocate and encircle an enemy. France during the 1930s had become content to shield behind the Maginot Line, a magnificent, largely subterranean defensive structure that had taken, at great cost, 10 years to build. It extended along the full extent of their border with Germany, but not along the border with Belgium. This was because France and Belgium had signed a defence pact as far back as 1920. But Belgium had little appetite for potential European conflicts. So in October 1936, Leopold III, the King of Belgium, unilaterally withdrew from the pact with France, announcing his country's neutrality before a year later obtaining a guarantee of neutrality from Nazi Germany. With this achieved, Belgium reorganized its armed forces into a merely defensive force, leaving France with a largely undefended northern border along which it would take many years to extend the Maginot Line. Consequently, General Gamelin placed his best troops along this border, the 7th French Army on the left, the French First Army on the right, and the British Expeditionary Force in the centre. His two weakest and least well-provisioned armies, the 2nd and 9th French armies, were deployed along the border close to the Ardennes forest. All these armies were ordered to dig in and create new defensive positions. Britain had assured France that the British Expeditionary Force, known as the BEF, would consist of at least 10 divisions. But by the end of 1939, just 4 divisions had arrived in France. They were formed into 2 army corps, with the 1st and 2nd Infantry Division in 1 corps and the 3rd and 4th Infantry Divisions in 2 corps. There were no British armoured divisions. In early November, Gamelin decided to change his strategy. Calling it the Dyle Plan, his idea was that if Belgium was invaded, the French 1st and 7th Armies, together with the BEF, would move forward to new positions largely along the rivers Dyle and Meuse, providing a defensive line from Antwerp to the end of the Maginot Line. The commander of Britain's 2 Corps was General Alan Brooke. Indisputably, he would become Britain's greatest general of the Second World War, and throughout, he kept a diary. This diary has since become one of the best sources of insight into events and strategies of the entire conflict. At this time, he viewed Gamelin's plan with skepticism, writing in November in his diary,
"The whole plan of the advance is fanciful, and can only result in disaster."
The Dyle Plan was based on Belgian assurances that they had developed new anti-tank defences along the River Dyle, which could be quickly occupied by French and British troops. Additionally, there would be more troops to defend this line, as the Belgian army would slot in between the French 7th Army and the BEF, and with the Dutch army joining to the north of the French army. Meanwhile, the weaker, poorly equipped and undermanned 9th and 2nd French armies would remain in their current positions along the river Meuse, just south of the Ardennes forest. These armies consisted largely of reservists with an average age of over 30. They had outdated weapons, very few anti-tank guns, and only a limited quantity of ammunition. Describing the Ardennes as Europe's best tank obstacle, Gamelin thought it would take at least 2 weeks for any army to penetrate the forest. But senior British commanders like Alan Brooke questioned the logic of Gamelin's decision. Moving troops forward at just the moment when civilians would be fleeing towards them from an advancing enemy would result in chaos, especially when the road network in the area would struggle to support so many troops all moving at the same time. Gamelin appears to have had a desire to keep the Germans as far from French soil as possible. But in due course, the new anti-tank defences along the Dyle would prove to be quite inadequate, and the expected 2 to 3 weeks for embedding British and French troops there would, in reality, be less than 4 days due to the speed of the German advance. Speculation about Germany's plans was heightened on the 10th of January when a German plane, lost in fog, crashed in Belgium. On board were 2 German officers, one of whom was carrying secret documents outlining Germany's current plans for the invasion of both Belgium and the Netherlands. Unsettled by the incident, Hitler ordered the High Command to change their plans. By chance, General Erich von Manstein was trying to put forward his alternative strategy. Following a personal meeting between von Manstein and Hitler in early March, Hitler ordered that von Manstein's plans should be used for the invasion of France. By the spring of 1940, with little in the way of active warfare, many amongst the Allies started to convince themselves that Hitler would not attack in the West. Britain, though, continued to mobilise, and an increasing number of troops were dispatched to France. On the 9th of April, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain proclaimed, "Hitler has missed the bus." He said,
"These 7 months of inactivity have enabled us to remove weaknesses, and so, enormously add to our fighting strength, that the future can be faced with a calm, steady mind."
Just a few days later, this calm was shattered as Germany invaded both Denmark and Norway. The aim was to deny the Royal Navy access to the Baltic, to safeguard their supplies of Swedish iron ore shipped to Germany through the Norwegian port of Narvik, and to obtain seaports with direct access to the Atlantic Ocean, which circumvented the Royal Navy's blockade of the North Sea. Largely through the insistence of Winston Churchill, a British Army Corps under General Claude Auchinleck was sent to take control of Narvik, and at the same time, the Royal Navy laid mines in the waters along the Norwegian coast as a deterrent to German shipping. But by the 7th of May, it was clear that British, French and Norwegian efforts in Norway were doomed to failure. The operation was highlighting Britain's unpreparedness for war. Inadequate provision, completely outgunned, and without sufficient air cover, British troops had no chance of withstanding the German invasion. Parliament debated the situation in Narvik. Chamberlain opened the debate in a lacklustre fashion, but it quickly turned into an argument about the competence of the British government in running the war. The House was electrified when the Conservative MP for Portsmouth, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Roger Keyes, stood up to speak. Dressed in his full admiral's uniform, with all his medals, he claimed to represent the view of the armed forces and stated they were frustrated by inept political leadership. Following this, a pillar of the Conservative Party, Leo Amery, rose to his feet to address the House.
Compromise and procrastination are the natural qualities of a political leader in times of peace. They are fatal qualities in war.
In devastating fashion, he continued by quoting Oliver Cromwell's words when expelling the Long Parliament nearly 300 years before.
You have sat here too long for any good that you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go.
Herbert Morrison for the Labour Party moved a motion of censure upon the government, leaving Chamberlain to call for support from what he called his political friends. But this drew a stinging riposte from David Lloyd George, Britain's leader during the First World War.
It is not a question as to who are the Prime Minister's friends, it is a far bigger issue. He has appealed for sacrifice. The nation is prepared for every sacrifice as long as it has leadership. I say solemnly that the Prime Minister should give an example of sacrifice, because there is nothing that can contribute more to victory in this war than that he should sacrifice the seals of office.
Churchill, being a member of the government, as First Lord of the Admiralty, manfully defended the government's handling of the Narvik campaign. But within 2 days, Neville Chamberlain had been forced to resign, and the King had sent for Churchill to form a new government. On that very same day, Germany launched its main attack in the West. Before the Allies had realised what was happening, the Luftwaffe had attacked French and British airfields, destroying many planes that were still on the ground. The French, without any radar or other early warning system, were caught napping, and for the remainder of the battle, the Allies would be seriously disadvantaged by Germany's resultant air superiority. Shortly afterwards, troops from General von Bock's Army Group B crossed the borders into Netherlands and central Belgium, while Army Group C under General von Leeb faced the French along the Maginot Line. In the Netherlands, German paratroops were used to secure vital bridges for the tanks to cross. Other vital infrastructure like airports was also captured in similar fashion. The outdated Dutch army, with its obsolete weapons, was no match for the Germans. Within just 5 days, most of the country had been overrun, with the Germans, on the 14th of May, demanding the surrender of Holland's largest port, Rotterdam. The Dutch hesitated, and immediately a large force of German bombers took off to attack the city and the port. While the bombers were airborne, the Dutch in Rotterdam surrendered, but it was too late. Rotterdam was bombed, causing considerable damage and death. The next day, the Dutch government capitulated. In Belgium, the Germans stormed across the neutral border and again, using paratroops, swiftly captured the Belgian fortress of Edam-Emael, which the Belgians thought was impregnable and was the linchpin of their first line of defense along the Albert Canal. The Belgians immediately pulled back to take their place in the defensive line along the River Dyle, where the British and French troops, delayed by traffic, were now arriving. But the Belgians deployed in positions allocated to Alan Brooke's left flank division, the 3rd Division, commanded by General Bernard Montgomery. 2 days were now lost, while international diplomacy, involving even the King of Belgium, attempted to sort out the issue. Consequently, on the 13th of May, Alan Brooke wrote in his diary,
"I do not think much of the Belgian army, and I am very nervous as to my left flank."
Adding a few days later,
"They are of poor fighting quality, and I would not trust them a yard."
Meanwhile, thinking the attack in central Belgium was Germany's main thrust, Gamelin was unaware of Germany's Army Group A under General von Rundstedt was advancing through the Ardennes with 45,000 armoured vehicles, of which 1,700 were the new, bigger and more powerful Panzers IIIs and IVs. They'd been moving unimpeded for 3 days along pathways prepared by well-trained battalions of engineers. On the 13th of May, 2 days before the Dutch surrender, Guderian's main panzer corps in Army Group A had reached the banks of the river Meuse near Sedan, where the French had already blown all the bridges. Meanwhile, just north, the 5th and 7th Panzer Division in General Gunther von Kluge's army were ahead of the game. The 7th Panzer Division, through dynamic leadership, had already crossed the river Meuse near Dinant the previous day. This division was commanded by a little-known general by the name of Guderian and Rommel, who would now become one of the pivotal commanders in Germany's armoured thrust into France. This division would gain the nickname the Ghost Division because nobody, including the Germans, quite knew where it was going to appear next. Usually armies had always waited for the artillery to arrive to provide covering fire before attempting a river crossing. But with the ethos of Blitzkrieg, neither Guderian nor Rommel were going to wait. Instead, Stuka dive bombers blasted the French 2nd and 9th Army positions along the river Meuse. German assault troops were soon across the river, forming bridgeheads so that engineers could start building pontoon bridges for the panzers to cross. Once across, Guderian's panzers quickly captured the Marfy Heights above Sedan, at which point General Charles Hunsinger, the commander of the French Second Army, made a fateful decision. Thinking that Guderian intended to turn east to attack the rear of the Maginot line, he pulled the Second Army east to cover such a possibility. But this merely opened the way for Guderian to race west, keeping parallel with Rommel, who was doing the same further north. Meanwhile, the Allies in the north of Belgium, including the BEF, had initially been holding the Germans along the Dyle line. But by the 15th of May, both the Belgian and French First Armies on either side of the BEF began to give way under German pressure. Alan Brooke wrote in his diary,
"The British Expeditionary Force is likely to have both its flanks turned and will have a very unpleasant time in extracting itself out of its current position."
All of a sudden, Gamelin started to panic about the growing threat to the panzer advance from the Ardennes along the valley of the Somme and ordered a pullback from the river Dyle. This was now complicated by the increasing quantity of refugees who were fleeing from the German advance and clogging the roads. As the Germans continued to advance on all fronts, Gamelin became increasingly confused and indecisive, leading, on the 19th of May, to him being relieved of command. It was a further 3 days before his replacement, the 73-year-old General Maxime Weygand, arrived to take over, during which time the Allies were leaderless. At the same time, the 84-year-old Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of the Battle of Verdun in the First World War, became France's Deputy Prime Minister. Guderian was determined not to give the Allies time to regroup and continued to press on. The following day, the 20th of May, his panzers reached the English Channel at the mouth of the River Somme. An encirclement had been achieved, just as von Rundstedt and von Manstein had planned. Cut off, British, French and Belgian troops now faced a desperate fight for survival in a cauldron battle intended to prevent them from remaining a fighting force. Weygand immediately attempted to coordinate flank attacks upon either side of von Rundstedt's thrust into France. From the north near Arras, the only 2 regiments of armour that Britain had managed to ship to France was ordered to attack Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. They were equipped with just 58 British-built Matilda tanks that were slow but well armoured. Although achieving some initial success, they were too few in number and lacked infantry and air support. Anyway, Rommel's division was far too strong for such a small force. Meanwhile, from the south, Charles de Gaulle's armoured division attacked Guderian's Panzer Corps, but suffered much the same fate. It was all too little, too late. And with a lack of political and military cohesion amongst the Allies, Weygand realised that coordinating such attacks was near impossible. Events now moved rapidly. Weygand ordered the armies in the north to fight their way out of the encirclement by attacking to the south. But on the 23rd of May, General Gaston Billot, the commander of the French army group, which included both the BEF and the Belgian army, was killed in a car crash. Meanwhile, King Leopold informed Weygand that his army was incapable of taking offensive action, as it was designed merely as a defensive force. And Lord Gort, the commander of the BEF, explained that he could only spare 2 divisions for any offensive operation because all the rest were fully stretched, all in the line against Germany's Army Group B. That same day, Guderian captured Boulogne and laid siege to Calais. The following day, von Rundstedt ordered Army Group A to halt, although the siege of Calais would continue. The German tank crews had become increasingly exhausted, and both infantry and supplies needed to catch up. Von Rundstedt felt that the marshy ground around Dunkirk was unsuitable for the panzers, making them vulnerable to attack. He was acutely aware that they would be needed in the second stage of the battle for France that was still to come. Hitler endorsed his decision, having also been convinced by Hermann Göring that the Luftwaffe would prevent any evacuation by destroying the BEF on the beaches of Dunkirk. To the north, Germany Armies Group B continued to press the Allies. Within the BEF, General Michael Barker, the commander of one corps, became unwell, leaving Alan Brooke to effectively oversee both corps. By the 23rd, 3 days after Guderian had reached the coast, cutting off the BEF's main supply lines from Le Havre, British soldiers were put on half rations, and concern began to grow as to how long their ammunition would last. Just 2 days later, it was clear that the Belgian army on the British left was disintegrating. The French 7th Army, which had been on their left, had already moved south to bolster the 9th Army, which had been smashed by the Germans breaking out of the Ardennes. The BF was now in serious danger of being cut off from the sea by German forces advancing from the north. For 2 days, Alan Brooke, coordinating both 1 and 2 Corps, worked feverishly to withdraw them so the gap could be plugged. On the 26th of May, Calais fell to the Germans, cutting off the last supply line to the BEF. The British government was by now under no illusions as to the seriousness of the situation. Lord Gort received a call from Anthony Eden, the Secretary of State for War, and was told,
"Consider evacuation, but don't let on to the French or the Belgians."
In fact, Gort had a week earlier started to prepare defensive positions along the canals around Dunkirk in preparation for that exact prospect. The following day, King Leopold II of Belgium, believing his country's position to be untenable, sought an armistice with Germany without consulting either France or Britain. When the Germans failed to respond, he surrendered his entire army unconditionally. At this point, General Alan Brooke was recalled to the UK to prepare for a possible new operation in France. Responsibility for withdrawing the BEF now fell upon 2 subordinates. General Harold Alexander, the commander of the 1st Division, was given command of 1 Corps, with the added responsibility of being in charge of the rear guard. And General Bernard Montgomery took over as acting commander of 2 Corps. Alan Brooke had formed a good opinion of both Alex and Monty, and later added a note to his diary about them.
It was intensely interesting watching Alex and Monty during those trying days. Both of them were completely imperturbable and efficient, yet they were 2 completely different characters. It was in those critical days that the appreciation I made of those 2 commanders remained rooted in my mind, and it resulted in the future selection of these 2 men to work together in the triumphal advance from Alamein to Tunis.
Part of the French First Army was now surrounded and cut off near Lille. After a fierce 4-day battle, they surrendered, having run out of food and ammunition. All that was left of the armies that had lined the River Dyle to defend Belgium just a fortnight earlier was the BEF and the remnants of the French First Army. The BEF was still largely intact and for the most part within a small pocket around Dunkirk. Little though remained of any of the French armies that had been deployed north of the River Somme. they had already sustained 92,000 killed and more than 200,000 wounded in the battle. They were no longer a threat to the Germans, who now sought to finish off the BEF. And so started the 9 days that were known as Operation Dynamo. Responsibility of this fell to Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who, just 2 years previously, had been forcibly retired after a long and distinguished career following a dispute with the head of the Royal Navy. But with the outbreak of the Second World War, a rather frustrated Ramsay sought a way back, applying to the new First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Ramsay came from a military family. His father had been a general, and his 2 elder brothers both had distinguished army careers. A lack of money to privately educate the third son had resulted in Bertram being sent to the Navy at a very young age, while his father commanded the 4th Hussars, in which was serving at the time a young Winston Churchill. On rejoining the Navy, Ramsay was sent to command Dover at the centre of a coastal area, where the naval command structure was flimsy, where defences, especially against submarines, was negligible, and where control over shipping in the Straits of Dover was paltry. What nobody foresaw was that Ramsay, a specialist in amphibious operations, would become one of the most significant commanders of the Second World War, responsible for planning and commanding the naval operations for D-Day, Operation Torch in North Africa, and the Allies' landings in both Sicily and Salerno. Having initially been responsible for ensuring the safe passage of supplies across the Channel to the BEF, he adapted his role by sending demolition teams to destroy naval facilities at ports about to be captured in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, to prevent them from being used by the Nazis against Britain. But on the evening of the 26th of May, at exactly 6:57 p.m, Ramsay received instructions from the Admiralty to launch an evacuation of British troops from Dunkirk, an operation that had been ordered by Churchill only moments before. It would become known as Operation Dynamo, supposedly taking its name from the former Dynamo Room in the naval headquarters, deep in the tunnels and the white cliffs below Dover Castle. It was from here that Ramsay planned and commanded the evacuation. He hastily assembled a fleet, 1 cruiser and 39 destroyers from the Royal Navy, 4 destroyers from Canada and 3 from France. He also pressed into service cross-channel ferries and a plethora of small pleasure craft that would famously become known as the Little Ships. He ordered a telephone line to be set up between himself and Captain William Tennant and his team, who he had immediately dispatched to Dunkirk to act as beachmasters. Government officials initially balked at the £500 cost of the line, but it would prove to be invaluable in helping to recover thousands of troops from France. The following day, the 27th of May, 11th Group of Fighter Command, under Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, was pressed into action to provide aerial cover for the evacuation. Flying from their bases, largely in Kent and Essex, 287 aircraft in 22 patrols flew that very same day. Over the next week, 11 Group flew over 3,500 sorties, inflicting a heavy toll on German bombers that had been sent to attack the troops in the harbour and on the beaches. It provided 11 Group with invaluable experience in preparing them for the battle which was still to come, the Battle of Britain. The RAF's intervention was timely, as on the 27th of May, the Luftwaffe started bombing Dunkirk, its ports and its beaches. Despite this, 25,000 troops were evacuated on that first full day, mainly from the harbour, where troops could step straight onto waiting ships. But within a few days, the harbour, the breakwater and the mole had all been put out of action by the Luftwaffe. However, 240,000 British and French troops had already been rescued. Now all evacuations would have to take place from the beach. At Dunkirk, the beaches shelved gently into the sea, so the Navy's destroyers, even at high tide, could not approach within 1 mile of the shore. This is where the little ships became invaluable, ferrying the troops from the beaches to the destroyers lying further out to sea. By the 30th of May, hundreds of civilian boats, crewed by civilian volunteers, had crossed to France to help the evacuation, assisted by the weather remaining fine and the sea calm. Meanwhile, since late 1939, the BBC had for the first time embedded a reporter with the British Army. His name was Richard Dimbleby, and he continued to report from the beaches of Dunkirk.
For days and nights, ships of all kinds have plied to and fro across the channel under the fierce onslaught of the enemy's bombers, utterly regardless of the perils, to bring out as many as possible of the trapped BEA.
By now, virtually every British unit had withdrawn inside the defences around Dunkirk. The operation was nearing completion. On the 3rd of June, Captain William Tennant and General Harold Alexander patrolled up and down the shoreline in a launch with a megaphone to ensure that no British soldiers were left behind. A total of 98,000 British and French troops were rescued from the beaches. The last Allied ship left Dunkirk at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 4th of June. At 10 a.m., the remnants of the rearguard, consisting of 40,000 French troops, surrendered and Dunkirk fell to the Germans. But through their efforts, 198,000 British troops and 140,000 French and Belgian troops had been saved. Operation Dynamo rescued the bulk of the British Army in what was the biggest evacuation ever undertaken in military history. Despite the terrible loss of weapons and equipment, Britain managed to recover its most precious and priceless asset, her trained and experienced soldiers that would be critical for the defence of the UK and for the rebuilding of the British Army. As soon as the capture of Dunkirk had been achieved, the Germans restarted the battle against the remaining French army. "112,000 of the French troops that had been evacuated at Dunkirk immediately returned to France through ports in Brittany and Normandy, and they rejoined their comrades defending the line along the River Somme. Hardened by their experiences in Flanders, they now fought tenaciously to defend their country. Weygand implemented defence in depth as a means of inflicting the maximum attrition upon the Germans, and he held armoured and mechanised divisions to the rear to use in counterattacks. For a few days, the French line held, but with extensive use of dive bombers to attack French positions, German infantry managed to inch forward and eventually managed to create crossings over the River Somme. Once the Panzer divisions had crossed, they quickly pushed into French lines. Soon, Rommel's Panzer division had captured Rouen, where he crossed the River Seine and raced into Normandy, capturing Channel ports on the way. By now, the French Air Force had virtually ceased to operate, and General Weygand was advising ministers that the French army, having been penetrated in numerous places by panzer incursions, was on the brink of collapse. To the east, the Maginot line was encircled and cut off by the Germans. The French there fought stoutly, and interestingly, German artillery failed to penetrate any of the fortresses along the Maginot Line. Panic seized the French nation. On the 10th of June, the French government fled Paris, declaring it an open city. At the same time, Italy joined the war and invaded France in the south. On the 13th of June, Churchill flew to Tours in central France to meet with the French government. Keen to find a way of keeping them in the war, he offered a union between France and the United Kingdom. But this was spectacularly rejected. The French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, was disappointed by this reaction from his cabinet and felt he no longer had their support. On the 16th of June, he resigned and was succeeded by the aging Philippe Pétain, who, in a radio address to the people of France, announced that he intended to seek an armistice with the Germans. 3 days later, Hitler arrived in France to negotiate the armistice agreement. The French signed the following day, and 3 days after that, the armistice came into effect, signaling the end of all fighting in France. The battle was over. France had been crushed and would remain under German occupation for the next 4 years. The Germans, having planned for up to 1 million casualties in the battle, had achieved victory with far fewer losses. Just 27,000 killed, around 115,000 wounded, and 18,000 missing. In just 6 weeks, Germany had conquered 4 countries and driven a 5th, the United Kingdom, from continental Europe. With a dramatically reworked Schlieffen Plan, Germany accomplished what they had failed to achieve in 4 years during the First World War. But this time, they had been aided by an inept French army and by Britain's complete lack of preparation for war, making this an easy victory for Hitler. General André Beaufort was later to contend that the collapse and defeat of the French army in 1940 was the most significant event of the 20th century. He wrote,
"Had the French army held, the Hitler regime would have almost certainly have fallen. There would have been no Nazi conquest of Western Europe, no Nazi assault on the Soviet Union, no Holocaust, and, most likely, no communist takeover of Eastern Europe."
And Generals von Rundstedt, reflecting after the war, believed that Germany's failure to destroy the British army at Dunkirk was the crucial moment that led to Germany's ultimate defeat 5 years later. He was to make the following observation:
"We should have known better after the First World War. The French came close to collapse in 1917. The British, even after our offensive against them in 1918, never showed any sign of collapse."
Britain would now become the country around which Western nations would coalesce in the fight against Hitler. British national resolve would not flinch and would be typified by Churchill's speeches to the British people.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. We can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, unlit uplands.